Have you ever wondered what lurks in Appalachia's forgotten towns? Tonight, 8 people share what they witnessed. Experiences so disturbing they'll never forget. Welcome to Black Fears. For privacy, names and identifying details have been changed, but these stories are real. From unexplained disappearances to sinister experiments, these accounts will challenge everything you think you know. Where are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Drop your location in the comments below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more true horror stories. My name is Marcus, and I worked third shift quality inspection at Mountain Valley Poultry in Pineville, Kentucky, where June 2017 brought heat so thick you could taste it even inside the refrigerated facility. The processing plant sprawled across 12 acres of concrete and aluminum siding, wedged between Route 441 and the Cumberland Gap. And I had walked those floors for 8 years, checking product temperatures and bacterial counts with a digital thermometer and swab kits that lived in my vest pockets. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in a constant hum that burrowed into your skull after the first hour, and the air always carried that sharp smell of bleach and raw poultry mixed with the metallic tang of the refrigeration units running full blast. Line 7 sat at the far end of the facility, processing breasts and thighs that came off the main conveyor in plastic-wrapped trays, and I had been assigned to monitor that line specifically after the day shift supervisor mentioned some inconsistencies in the cooler logs. I didn't think much of it that first night, when I clocked in at 11, grabbed my inspection kit, and headed toward the back where Line 7 hummed under those flickering lights that maintenance never seemed to fix. The meat looked wrong almost immediately. I had inspected thousands of chicken breasts, knew exactly what properly refrigerated poultry should look like, but the product moving down Line 7 had developed an unusual sheen, almost iridescent under the lights, and when I pressed my gloved finger against one package, the texture felt different. Slightly more yielding than it should be. I logged the observation in my notebook, took a temperature reading that came back at 38 degrees, which was higher than the required 32, but not critically so, and moved on to the next batch. The night wore on in that peculiar way third shift always did, time stretching and compressing simultaneously, and around 2 in the morning I noticed Francisco and Andy from the packaging line both scratching at their forearms through their protective sleeves. I thought nothing of it until my own arms started itching during my 3 a.m. round, a sensation like tiny insects crawling just beneath the skin, and when I pulled back my sleeve in the break room, I found a rash spreading across my inner forearm in a pattern that looked almost geometric, perfect. Lines of raised red welts that formed angles my skin shouldn't naturally create. Francisco was there too, comparing his identical rash with Andy, who stood by the vending machines with her sleeves rolled up, revealing the exact same pattern on both her arms. We all tasted copper, that metallic flavor coating our tongues like we'd been sucking on pennies, and I felt my skin growing tight across my face and hands as if my body was shrinking inside itself. The sensation was wrong in a way I couldn't articulate, a fundamental wrongness that made my stomach clench. And when I returned to Line 7, the meat had progressed beyond unusual into something that made me want to back away slowly. The chicken had developed colors that shouldn't exist in organic tissue, deep purples and blues swirling beneath the surface like oil on water, and the smell had changed from the normal raw poultry scent to something that reminded me of ozone and burned plastic. I pulled out my thermometer with hands that shook slightly, took a reading, and watched the digital display climb past 40 degrees, past 50, past 70, even though the refrigeration unit's external gauge showed the cooler running at its proper temperature of 28 degrees. The conveyor belt continued its endless loop, carrying impossibly warm meat through a refrigerated environment, and my radio crackled with static before Andy's voice came through, asking if anyone else felt like their bones were growing too large for their body. That's exactly what it felt like, I realized, as if my skeleton was expanding while my skin stayed the same size, creating pressure that built behind my eyes and in my joints and deep in my chest where my ribs connected to my sternum. I started walking toward the supervisor's office. Needed to report this. Needed to shut down line 7. But my legs moved wrong, joints bending at angles that sent shooting pain up through my hips. Francisco was on the floor near the packaging station, his body contorting in ways that violated basic human anatomy, spine arching backward while his knees bent forward. And the sound he made was something between screaming and choking that I knew I'd hear for the rest of my life. Andy collapsed next, her arms twisting like wet rope being wrung out, and I felt my own body beginning to betray me as my shoulder blades pushed against my skin from the inside, creating pressure points that felt like they might rupture through. I made it to the wall-mounted emergency shutoff and slammed my palm against it, killing power to line 7. But the damage was done, and the screaming continued as 2 more workers from the cleaning crew went down in the exact same convulsive movements. I crawled toward the supervisor's office because my legs wouldn't hold me anymore, dragged myself across concrete that felt ice cold against my face, even though the building was climate-controlled, and somehow got my hand on the phone to dial 911 with fingers that bent at wrong angles. I gave the address, reported multiple workers down, possible chemical exposure, and then I was on the floor watching the ceiling tiles blur and sharpen in rhythm with my heartbeat that felt like it was trying to escape through my throat. The emergency response came fast, paramedics and hazmat teams flooding the facility, but by then I was somewhere else in my head, consciousness sliding sideways, while my body performed functions I couldn't control. I woke up 3 days later in a hospital bed with no memory of the ambulance ride or the first 72 hours of treatment, and the doctor spoke in careful language about unusual symptoms and complicated recovery while avoiding any real explanation of what had happened. Francisco and Andy survived, but neither would talk about it, and 2 workers I didn't know well stayed hospitalized with what the official reports called complications, a word that carried no real meaning but served to paper over questions nobody wanted answered. The facility closed permanently within a week, corporate headquarters issuing statements about equipment malfunction and pending investigation, but I knew it ran deeper than faulty refrigeration. I found the maintenance logs one afternoon while collecting my final paycheck, tucked into a folder someone had left in the employee break room, and the handwritten entries dated back 6 months showing deliberate temperature manipulation on line 7. Someone had been gradually increasing the cooler temperature in tiny increments, 1 degree every few days, creating conditions that allowed something to develop in the meat, some bacterial or fungal growth that the logs didn't identify but tracked with clinical precision. The entries noted observations about color changes and texture modifications and worker symptoms, documented like a scientific experiment with human subjects who hadn't consented to participation. I took photos with shaking hands and sent them to the state health department and OSHA and anyone else I could think of, but the investigation went nowhere, buried under corporate lawyers and sealed settlements and non-disclosure agreements that the hospitalized workers signed in exchange for ongoing medical coverage. The processing plant was demolished 8 months later, the entire structure razed, and the ground beneath excavated to a depth of 15 feet, removing every trace of whatever had been happening on Line 7. I attended one meeting with a state investigator who asked perfunctory questions and took notes he never seemed to actually read, and then the case was closed with findings of mechanical failure and inadequate safety protocols. Francisco moved to Ohio and changed his phone number, and Andy left the state entirely, both of them running from something that had burrowed into their bodies and changed them at a level the doctors couldn't measure. The 2 workers who stayed, hospitalized, were eventually transferred to a long-term care facility, where they remained under observation for complications that medical science apparently couldn't name or treat, and I sometimes wonder if they're still there. Bodies performing functions that violate everything we understand about human physiology. I still taste copper every single time I close my eyes. that metallic flavor coating my tongue like a permanent reminder of what happened on line 7. My skin feels wrong sometimes, too tight across my bones, and I avoid mirrors on bad days because I swear I can see something moving beneath the surface, some leftover contamination that the emergency treatment didn't fully purge. I moved to Tennessee 6 months after the facility closed, found work doing inventory management for a dry goods distributor where nothing needs refrigeration and nothing organic passes through my hands, but the nightmares follow me regardless of geography. I see Francisco's spine bending backward in ways that should have snapped his vertebrae. Hear Andy's screams as her joints dislocated and relocated in impossible configurations. Feel my own skeleton trying to escape through my skin, while my consciousness watched helplessly from somewhere deep inside my skull. The worst part is knowing someone did this deliberately. Someone documented our suffering with clinical detachment and tracked the progression of symptoms like we were lab rats in a maze. Those maintenance logs showed intent, showed planning, showed a mind that understood exactly what would happen when you exposed meat to specific temperature variations and then exposed human workers to that contaminated product. I don't know who wrote those logs, don't know if they worked for the company or represented some outside interest conducting unauthorized research. And the investigation never identified the author, despite my photos clearly showing handwritten entries that could have been analyzed. The corporate settlement I eventually signed came with money that felt like blood payment and a gag order that prevents me from discussing specifics, but I can still tell my story as long as I frame it as personal experience rather than corporate accusation. I keep the photos on an encrypted drive hidden in 3 different cloud storage locations because I don't trust that someone won't try to make them disappear, and every few months I check to make sure the files are still there, still readable, still documenting what happened to us on line 7. Francisco and Andy don't respond to my messages anymore, haven't for years, and I understand their silence because some experiences damage you so fundamentally that even talking about them feels like reopening wounds that never properly healed. The 2 hospitalized workers, whose names I never learned, remain anonymous in my memory. Faces I can't quite recall, but bodies I remember perfectly as they twisted into shapes that physics shouldn't allow. And I carry guilt about not knowing their names, not fighting harder to get them proper treatment, not breaking my NDA to shout about what happened until someone listened. Sometimes I drive past where the facility used to stand, just a flat expanse of gravel now with a for sale sign listing commercial property availability. And I taste copper so strong I have to pull over and spit on the roadside. The ground looks normal, innocent even. No trace of the horrors that occurred there, or the deliberate contamination that transformed human bodies into something other than what they started as. I wonder if the excavation really removed everything, or if something remains in the soil, in the water table, in the air that still carries that faint smell of ozone and burned plastic on certain nights when the wind comes from the right direction. The town moved on. Other industries filled the employment gap, and nobody talks about Mountain Valley Poultry anymore, except in the past tense, as a brief economic blip that came and went. But I can't move on because my body won't let me forget, because every time my skin feels too tight or my bones ache in that particular way, I'm back on that concrete floor watching ceiling tiles blur while my skeleton tries to reshape itself. I taste copper, and I'm 27 again, crawling toward a phone with fingers that won't bend correctly, hearing Francisco scream and Andy collapse, and feeling my own consciousness sliding toward someplace dark, where bodies don't have to follow the rules biology laid down. The settlement money sits in my bank account mostly untouched because spending it feels like validating what happened, like accepting payment for permanent damage and calling it square. I keep working jobs that have nothing to do with food production or quality inspection, or anything that might trigger the specific combination of sensory inputs that send me back to line 7 in June 2017, when the heat was thick and the meat was wrong, and my body learned it could betray me in ways I never imagined possible. What stays with me most is the clinical precision of those maintenance logs, the careful documentation of our deterioration, the scientific interest in human suffering that someone felt strongly enough about to risk criminal charges and corporate liability. Someone watched us changing and took notes. Someone calibrated the temperature increases to maximize contamination while minimizing detection. Someone knew exactly what would happen and let it happen anyway, because the data was more important than our bodies, or our sanity, or our futures. I've spent 7 years trying to understand that kind of mindset, that willingness to transform human beings into experimental subjects without consent or warning. And I still can't comprehend it, still can't find the psychological framework that makes such actions seem justified or even logical. The copper taste never fully leaves my mouth now, just fades to manageable levels between episodes. And I've learned to live with skin that feels foreign, and bones that ache with phantom growth, and dreams where my body performs impossible geometry while I watch from somewhere outside myself. This is my life after line 7, after someone decided my flesh was less important than their research, after the meat went wrong and took us with it into territory where human physiology becomes suggestion rather than law. I tell this story not because I've healed or found closure or made peace with what happened, but because silence feels like letting them win, like accepting that some horrors are too expensive to acknowledge or too complicated to punish. My name is Marcus. I worked third shift at a processing plant in Kentucky, and what happened to me there in June 2017 should never happen to anyone ever again. My name is Brian, and I've been an amateur radio operator since I was 16 years old, running a small setup in my basement in Helvetia, West Virginia, where October 1998 brought fog so dense it erased the mountains from view. My equipment wasn't fancy, just a Yaesu FT897D transceiver I'd saved 2 years to buy, a wire antenna strung between my house and the oak tree in the backyard, and a logbook where I recorded every contact I made with other operators across the country. Helvetia was barely a town, maybe 50 residents scattered across the valley, and the isolation made it perfect for radio work because there wasn't much electrical interference to corrupt the signals. I spent most evenings after my shift at the lumber mill scanning frequencies, listening to conversations between operators in California and Maine and everywhere in between. That particular satisfaction of connecting voices across impossible distances through nothing but electromagnetic waves and persistence. October 15th started normal enough, me settling into my basement chair around 9 p.m. with a cup of coffee that had gone lukewarm during dinner, adjusting my headphones and spinning the dial through the usual bands looking for interesting traffic. The static crackled and popped in that familiar way. White noise punctuated by brief fragments of voice as I passed through occupied frequencies, and then around 14.2 MHz, I caught something that made me stop and reverse the dial. It wasn't voice exactly, more like a series of tones arranged in patterns that felt almost like speech, rising and falling with rhythm that suggested meaning even though the sounds themselves made no linguistic sense. I grabbed my pencil and started transcribing what I heard into my logbook, writing down the tonal patterns as best I could represent them with letters and numbers. But the moment my pencil touched paper, a headache bloomed behind my right eye, sharp and sudden like someone had driven a nail through my skull from temple to temple. I dropped the pencil, and the pain receded immediately, fading to a dull throb that disappeared within seconds. And I sat there staring at the incomplete transcription, wondering if I'd imagined the connection. I picked up the pencil again and resumed writing, and the headache returned with such intensity that my vision blurred and I tasted bile in the back of my throat. The transmission continued, those strange tonal patterns repeating with variations, and I realized I was hearing what might have been a loop, except each repetition introduced subtle changes that prevented it from being identical. I released the pencil and just listened, letting the sounds wash over me without trying to document them, and after maybe 15 minutes the transmission ended abruptly, cutting off mid-pattern and leaving only static in its wake. I posted about it the next morning on the amateur radio forum I frequented, describing the frequency and the tonal patterns and asking if anyone else had heard similar transmissions. 3 responses came back within hours, all from operators in surrounding counties, all confirming they'd picked up something unusual on that frequency. But when we compared notes, the details didn't match. An operator in Pocahontas County described hearing what sounded like Morse code, but with timing intervals that made no sense and spelled nothing coherent. Someone in Pendleton County reported voices speaking in overlapping layers, 3 or 4 conversations happening simultaneously in languages they couldn't identify. A woman in Randolph County logged mechanical sounds, rhythmic clicking and humming that reminded her of industrial machinery, but with no identifiable source or pattern. We were all hearing the same frequency, but experiencing completely different content, which violated everything I understood about radio transmission. A signal broadcast on a specific frequency should be identical for all receivers within range. The physics didn't allow for personalized variations, unless someone was somehow targeting individual operators with separate transmissions, and that level of sophistication seemed impossible for anything on the amateur bands. I started monitoring 14.285 MHz every night, logging when transmissions occurred and trying to find patterns in the timing or content. The tonal sequences I heard began to feel familiar, not in the sense that I recognized them, but in the way they seemed to anticipate what I expected to hear next. Patterns that suggested some kind of intelligence was adapting the transmission based on my reception. 5 days into my monitoring, I noticed something that made my stomach clench with a fear I couldn't rationally justify. I had logged a series of tonal patterns on October 19th that seemed random at the time, just another variation in the ongoing transmission. But on October 20th, a car accident occurred at the intersection of Route 92 and County Road 18, exactly 7 miles from my house. The accident happened at 3:47 p.m., involved a blue pickup truck and a silver sedan, and resulted in minor injuries to both drivers, but no fatalities. When I reviewed my logs from the 19th, I realized the tonal pattern I'd heard and failed to transcribe could be interpreted as coordinates if I assigned numerical values to the tone frequencies, and those coordinates pinpointed that exact intersection. The timestamp of the transmission was 8:47 p.m., exactly 17 hours before the accident occurred. I told myself it was coincidence, pattern recognition run wild, the human brain's tendency to find meaning in random data, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd heard a prediction. I started paying closer attention to the patterns, trying to decode them into something useful, and on October 23rd, I recorded a sequence that my increasingly paranoid mind interpreted as coordinates for the post office in town, and a time that might correspond to 11:15 a.m. if I converted the tonal frequencies using a formula I'd invented based on nothing but intuition and desperation. I drove to the post office the next morning and sat in my truck across the street, feeling ridiculous and stalkerish, but at exactly 11:15 a.m. a shelf inside collapsed, sending packages tumbling to the floor in a crash I could hear from outside. Nobody was hurt. Nothing significant happened, but it had happened when and where the transmission suggested it would. The logs from other operators stopped appearing on the form after the first week. I reached out directly to the 3 who had responded initially, but 2 didn't reply, and the 3rd sent a brief message saying they decided to stop monitoring that frequency for personal reasons they didn't want to discuss. I was alone with whatever was broadcasting on 14.285 MHz, and the transmissions were getting longer, sometimes running for hours with those tonal patterns that bypassed my ears entirely and seemed to drill directly into my brain. I stopped trying to transcribe them after the headaches became severe enough to cause nosebleeds, just listened and let the patterns wash through me while I tried to understand what they wanted, or why they'd chosen amateur radio bands to communicate whatever they were communicating. November brought the discovery that shattered every assumption I'd built about reality and causation. I had set up a voice-activated recorder to capture my transmissions automatically, standard practice for operators who wanted to review their contacts or document interesting propagation conditions. The recorder ran whenever my transceiver was powered on, capturing both my voice and anything I received through the speakers. On November 7th, I was reviewing recordings from the previous week, mostly routine contacts with other operators and long stretches of static, when I heard my own voice speaking words I had never said. The timestamp showed 2:33 a.m. on November 4th, a time when I'd been asleep in bed upstairs, my equipment powered down, and the basement dark. But the recording clearly captured my voice, engaging in a one-sided conversation with someone or something I couldn't hear. My recorded voice was discussing technical details about radio propagation, explaining concepts I understood intellectually but would never articulate in that precise clinical language. And then it switched to something else entirely, words in what might have been Latin or Greek or some other language I'd never studied. The phonemes were wrong for English, the rhythm foreign, but the voice was unmistakably mine, accent and inflection, and the slight lisp I'd never quite overcome. I played it back 3 times, feeling my skin crawl with each repetition, and then I checked the equipment to see if someone could have somehow hacked my system and broadcast using my transceiver without my knowledge. Everything was secure, no evidence of tampering, and the power logs I obsessively maintained showed the system had been off during the timestamp when my voice was recorded. I started staying awake at night, monitoring both the frequency and my equipment, determined to catch whatever was using my voice or understand how the recording had captured something that couldn't have happened. The transmissions continued on 14,285 MHz, those tonal patterns that now felt like they were rewriting something inside my skull. And on November 10th, I heard my own voice come through the speakers during a live transmission. I wasn't speaking, my mouth was closed, and my hands were shaking as I gripped the edge of my desk, but my voice was discussing weather patterns in Helvetia for the upcoming week, with specificity that suggested either intimate local knowledge or accurate prediction. 3 days later, every detail proved correct. Temperatures and precipitation and wind direction matching exactly what the voice using my mouth had described. The final transmission I remember clearly came on November 14th at 9:23 p.m., and it was a recording of a conversation I would have 3 days later with my supervisor at the lumber mill. I heard my voice discussing a change in my work schedule, heard his voice responding with specific dates and times, heard myself agreeing to terms that hadn't been offered yet. On November 17th, my supervisor called me into his office and had that exact conversation, word for word, pause for pause, and I found myself responding with the exact phrases I'd heard on the recording because they were already in my mouth, already inevitable. I tried to deviate from the script, tried to say something different, or react in a way the prediction hadn't anticipated, but my voice betrayed me and spoke the predetermined words while I watched from somewhere behind my eyes. I dismantled my radio equipment that night, unscrewed every connection, and packed every component into boxes I sealed with tape and shoved into the furthest corner of my basement. I canceled my amateur radio license and stopped participating in forums and deleted every log I'd ever kept except the ones from October and November 1998, which I buried in a waterproof container in my backyard. The transmissions stopped after I destroyed my antenna, cut it down with wire cutters, and burned the pieces in a barrel behind my house. But the damage was already complete. Something had changed in how my brain processed time and causation. rewired through weeks of exposure to those tonal patterns that bypassed normal auditory processing and work directly on whatever neural structures govern our perception of past and future. 27 years later, I work security at a shopping center in Charleston, as far from Helvetia as I could get while staying in West Virginia, and I avoid anything that might pick up radio signals. No wireless devices, no Bluetooth, no cellular data unless absolutely necessary, and I keep my phone in a Faraday bag when I'm not actively using it. But the precognitions haven't stopped. They've just changed form. I dream conversations before they happen, taste food I haven't eaten yet, smell rain 3 days before storms arrive. My body knows the future in fragments and pieces, small glimpses that prove accurate often enough to confirm I'm not delusional or imagining patterns in randomness. The worst part isn't knowing what's coming. It's the helplessness of watching yourself perform actions you've already heard yourself take. Free will becomes theoretical when your voice speaks predetermined words and your hands complete gestures you observed 3 days ago on recordings that shouldn't exist. I live slightly out of sync with everyone around me, experiencing time as a loop I'm trapped inside, and sometimes I wonder if the other operators who monitored 14.85 Hmts in October 1998 are experiencing the same thing. Maybe we're all out here, scattered across counties and states, living lives that were recorded before we lived them, speaking from scripts we heard ourselves read on frequencies that shouldn't be able to carry human voices at all. I still hear the frequencies sometimes, particularly during electrical storms when the atmospheric conditions create propagation paths that shouldn't exist. They come through my dental fillings, those same tonal patterns resonating in the metal and conducting directly into my jawbone and skull, and I know whatever was broadcasting on 14.85 Hertz never really stopped. It's still out there, still adapting its signal to individual receivers, still rewiring human neurology one operator at a time. The transmissions found me through amateur radio bands and changed something fundamental about how I experience causation. And now I exist in this strange liminal space where past and future blur together, and I'm never quite certain which version of myself I'm inhabiting at any given moment. The frequencies are always humming beneath the surface of normal reality, and once you've been tuned to receive them, you never fully tune out again. The static becomes part of your baseline, becomes the sound your thoughts make when they're translating signals from dimensions that don't share our temporal coordinates. I don't know what was broadcasting or why it chose amateur radio operators in West Virginia counties in 1998, but I know it succeeded in whatever its purpose was. It found frequencies we were listening to, adapted its signal to our individual reception capabilities, and transformed us into something capable of detecting broadcasts from timelines that haven't occurred yet, or maybe already happened, depending on which direction causation actually flows. Sometimes late at night, when I'm alone in the security office watching monitors that show empty parking lots and locked storefronts, I taste copper and smell ozone and hear those tonal patterns echoing in my skull. The headaches return, sharp pain behind my right eye, and I know another prediction is coming. Another conversation I'll have tomorrow. Another event I'll witness next week. Another proof that linear time is just a comfortable fiction we tell ourselves to make sense of existence that's actually far stranger and more recursive than human consciousness was designed to process. The radio silence that followed my dismantled equipment was never really silent at all. The broadcasts continue. I just stopped needing external receivers to pick them up. Whatever frequency they're on, I'm permanently tuned to it now, and there's no amount of Faraday shielding or distance or denial that will ever change that. Have you ever felt like you were living moments you'd already experienced, or knew what someone would say before they spoke? What's the strangest déjà vu you've ever had? My name is Johanna, and I've worked as a deputy for the Wythe County Sheriff's Department in Wytheville, Virginia, for 11 years, patrolling these mountain roads where March 2019 brought cold that sank into your bones, no matter how many layers you wore. Route 52 cuts through our jurisdiction like a scar, 23 miles of asphalt that winds between hills, where cell service drops out and fog settles so thick you can barely see your hood ornament. I'd driven that road thousands of times, responded to accidents and disabled vehicles and the occasional drunk driver weaving between lanes, but nothing prepared me for the call that came through dispatch at 6:47 p.m. on March 19th about an abandoned vehicle with its engine still running and dinner getting cold on the passenger seat. The Chevy Malibu sat on the shoulder near mile marker 34, hazard lights flashing rhythmically in the gathering dusk, and when I pulled up behind it with my spotlight illuminating the interior, I could see everything looked wrong in that specific way that makes your instincts scream before your conscious mind catches up. The driver's door hung open at a 45-degree angle, keys dangling from the ignition, radio playing some country station at low volume. 2 styrofoam containers from the diner in town sat on the passenger seat, steam still rising from the contents when I approached with my hand resting on my service weapon purely from habit. The registration came back to Mercy Whitfield, 32 years old, address in town, no warrants or flags in the system, and her purse was on the floor behind the driver's seat with wallet and phone still inside. I called it in as a possible missing person and started the standard protocol, checking the immediate area for signs of where she might have gone. The ground was hard-packed dirt and gravel on the shoulder, not ideal for tracking. But I found a single set of footprints leading from the driver's side door toward the tree line that marked the beginning of thousands of acres of national forest. The prints looked normal, regular walking gait, no signs of running or struggle, and I followed them into the woods with my flashlight cutting through shadows that seemed to press in from all sides. 40 feet in, the prints just stopped, not faded or obscured, not lost in underbrush or rocky ground, just ended mid-stride as if Mercy had simply ceased to exist between one step and the next. I radioed for backup, and additional units marked the location with evidence tape, and began a circular search pattern expanding out from where the footprints terminated. The forest was quiet in that unnatural way that makes you notice the absence of sound, no birds or insects or wind through branches, just oppressive silence that made my breathing seem too loud. Other deputies arrived within 20 minutes, and we established a proper search grid, but nobody found anything. No more prints, no disturbed vegetation, no signs that anyone had passed through the area beyond that single trail of footprints, ending impossibly in clear ground. We called in search and rescue teams with dogs, and that's when things shifted from strange to fundamentally wrong. The dogs tracked Mercy's scent from the vehicle without hesitation, following the exact path I'd documented. But when they reached the spot where the footprints ended, they reacted with behavior their handlers had never seen before. Both German shepherds, trained animals with hundreds of successful tracks between them, stopped dead and started whining, then growling, then showing teeth at empty air. One dog lunged forward as if attacking something invisible, snapping at nothing while its handler struggled to control it. The second dog backed away, hackles raised, refusing to advance no matter how much its handler encouraged. We pulled the animals back and tried different approach angles, but the response was identical. They would not cross into the area beyond where Mercy's prints ended, would not continue tracking, and both animals showed signs of extreme distress that persisted until we walked them back to the vehicles. We set up a command post and brought in additional resources, state police and Forest Service rangers, and volunteers from town who formed search lines and combed through acres of woodland looking for any trace. I went back to the vehicle to process it more thoroughly, photographing everything and documenting the scene in meticulous detail. Mercy's phone showed she'd called 911 at 6:41 p.m., exactly 6 minutes before we received the report about her vehicle, but dispatch had no record of any call from her number. I checked the call log 3 times, verified with communications that their system showed no incoming calls from that number on that date. But Mercy's phone clearly displayed a 3-minute call to 911 at that timestamp. The audio recording app on her phone had been running, possibly triggered accidentally, and when I played back the last recording, it was just 3 minutes of road noise and radio music, nothing that indicated distress or reason to stop. The search continued through the night and into the next day, thermal imaging helicopters scanning the forest for heat signatures, but the only results were deer and smaller wildlife, nothing human-sized except the searchers themselves. I stayed on scene for 18 hours straight, coordinating efforts and following up on every potential lead that came in, and that's when the trail camera footage arrived. The state had positioned cameras throughout the national forest for wildlife management, motion-activated units that captured anything larger than a raccoon passing through their field of view. A ranger brought me memory cards from 3 cameras positioned within a quarter mile of where Mercy disappeared, and we reviewed the footage on a laptop in the command tent. 2 cameras showed nothing unusual, just deer and a black bear ambling through at dawn. The 3rd camera, positioned about 200 yards from where the footprints ended, had captured something that made my skin prickle with instinctive revulsion. The timestamp showed 6:44 p.m., 3 minutes after Mercy's supposed 911 call, and the footage showed her walking between trees in a direct line that would bring her toward the camera's position. But she wasn't walking right. Her joints bent at angles that human anatomy doesn't permit, knees articulating backward, spine twisting in ways that should have left her paralyzed or screaming. She moved smoothly, though, no signs of pain or distress, just impossible locomotion that looked almost mechanical in its precision. The footage ran for 12 seconds as she passed through the frame, and in that time she never looked at the camera, never deviated from her straight-line path, never showed any indication she was aware of her surroundings or her own impossible movements. I watched that footage maybe 50 times, trying to find some explanation that didn't require abandoning everything I understood about physics and biology. Some trick of perspective, some optical illusion created by shadows and low light, anything that would make it make sense. But the more I watched, the clearer it became that Mercy was moving in ways that violated fundamental rules about how bodies work, and she was doing it smoothly, efficiently, as if those backward bending joints and spiral spine were somehow her natural state. The footage ended when she passed out of frame, heading deeper into forest where no other cameras were positioned, and we never found another trace of her, despite days of intensive searching. The investigation went on for weeks. Interviews with everyone who knew Mercy, deep dives into her background, looking for anything that might suggest why she'd stop on Route 52 and walk into the woods. Nothing unusual emerged. She worked as a bookkeeper for a construction company, lived alone in a small rental house, had no history of mental health issues or drug use or anything that would predict bizarre behavior. Her dinner had been picked up 17 minutes before her vehicle was found, which aligned with the drive time from the diner to mile marker 34, suggesting she'd stopped almost immediately after leaving town. The restaurant staff said she'd seemed normal, friendly, nothing about her demeanor suggesting distress or altered mental state. 2 weeks after her disappearance, Mercy's voicemail received a new message. I was listed as the primary investigator, so her phone records forwarded to my attention, and I listened to 3 minutes of steady breathing with background sounds that analysis couldn't definitively identify. Not forest sounds, not road noise, not anything in the database of environmental audio that forensic specialists maintain for exactly this kind of comparison. The breathing was rhythmic, calm, and the cadence matched Mercy's respiratory rate based on medical records we'd obtained. Someone who sounded exactly like her had called her own voicemail and breathed steadily for 3 minutes, then disconnected. The call originated from a location the carrier identified as the National Forest, but the specific coordinates placed it in an area we'd searched multiple times without finding any evidence of human presence. I've handled missing person cases before, some resolved happily with people found safe, others ending in tragedy when we locate remains, and a few that stay open indefinitely because we never find anything at all. But Mercy's disappearance occupies a different category, something that doesn't fit existing frameworks or follow patterns I recognize from training and experience. The footprints that stop mid-stride, the dogs that refuse to continue tracking, the trail camera footage showing impossible locomotion, the voicemail from someone who should be missing but called from the exact area we'd exhausted our search efforts. Every piece of evidence contradicts either itself or basic assumptions about how reality functions. The case remains officially active, but the active search phase ended after 4 weeks, when we'd covered every accessible square mile of forest within a reasonable radius and found absolutely nothing. No body, no clothing, no signs of disturbance, nothing except that single trail of footprints ending in clear ground and 12 seconds of footage showing a woman moving in ways that human bodies shouldn't be able to move. I still drive Route 52 on patrol, still pass mile marker 34 where her vehicle sat, with engine running and dinner getting cold. And every time I taste something metallic on my tongue and smell something I can't quite identify that reminds me of thunderstorms and machinery and things that don't belong in Appalachian forests. The trail camera footage lives on an encrypted drive in evidence storage, and I'm the only deputy who's watched it enough times to notice the subtle details that make it worse. The way Mercy's head rotates slightly further than necks should rotate, the way her fingers extend just a fraction too long, the way her shadow doesn't quite match her body position given the angle of available light. Small wrongnesses that accumulate into the overwhelming certainty that whatever walked through that forest on March 19th wasn't quite Mercy anymore, or maybe had never been Mercy at all despite looking exactly like her and driving her car and picking up dinner from her usual restaurant. I don't know if she's alive somewhere in those woods, transformed into something that moves wrong and calls voicemail numbers to breathe steadily for 3 minutes. I don't know if she walked willingly into whatever took her footprints and left that disturbing footage behind. I don't know why dogs trained to track through any conditions refused to follow her scent beyond a specific point, or why the forest went silent in ways that made experienced searchers uncomfortable. The investigation remains open because I won't close it until I understand what happened. But understanding might not be possible when the evidence contradicts fundamental assumptions about reality. Mercy walked into those woods at 6:44 p.m. on March 19, 2019, and something that looked like her continued deeper into forest, where cameras captured 12 seconds of impossible movement before she vanished completely, leaving only questions that no amount of police work seems capable of answering. Have you ever been on a road where something felt fundamentally wrong, like the area itself was watching you? What happened when you trusted that instinct? My name is Zane, and I inherited my grandmother's property in Rogersville, Tennessee 3 days after her funeral in August 2015, a 7-acre plot with a farmhouse built in 1947 that smelled like lavender and old wood even after sitting empty for 2 weeks. She'd raised me after my parents died when I was 8, taught me how to fish in the creek that ran along the back boundary, and how to identify edible plants in the forest that pressed against the property line. I thought I knew every inch of that land, every room in that house, but grief has a way of making familiar places strange, and when I started going through her belongings to prepare the estate, I found the basement door hidden behind a bookshelf in the hallway I'd walked past 10,000 times without noticing. The door was solid oak, older than the house itself based on the hand-forged hinges, and it opened onto stairs that descended into darkness that my flashlight barely penetrated. The basement was bigger than the house's footprint suggested it should be, stretching back into space that geometrically shouldn't exist, and the air down there tasted like minerals and something organic that made my throat close up reflexively. Mason jars lined shelves that covered every wall, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, and each contained something preserved in cloudy liquid that might have been formaldehyde or brine or something else entirely. I lifted one jar carefully, brought it close to my flashlight, and immediately wished I hadn't because the contents looked almost like tissue, almost like organs, but not from any animal I could identify. The shapes were wrong, structures that suggested biological function, but arranged in configurations that made no evolutionary sense. Some jars held things that might have been eyes, except they had too many pupils or irises that spiraled in fractal patterns. Others contained what could have been teeth, if teeth grew in clusters like grapes and curved inward on themselves. I set the jar back with shaking hands and noticed the labels, handwritten in my grandmother's precise script, showing dates going back to 1945 and locations throughout the property. She'd been collecting these things, preserving them, cataloging them with scientific precision for 70 years, and I'd never seen her do anything more unusual than tend her garden and bake bread on Sundays. I spent 3 hours in that basement, documenting what I found, taking photos that didn't capture how deeply wrong everything felt, and trying to convince myself there was some rational explanation. Maybe she'd been a biology teacher I didn't know about. Maybe these were research specimens from some legitimate scientific endeavor. Maybe the strangeness was just preservation artifacts making normal tissue look unusual, but the labels told a different story. Coordinates scattered across the 7 acres, with notes about lunar phases and seasonal markers and ritual maintenance that had no place in scientific documentation. The most recent jar was dated 2 weeks before her death, collected from the northwest corner near the old oak tree, and the contents looked fresh despite the preservation fluid, almost alive in the way they seemed to shift position when I wasn't looking directly at them. I left the basement as the sun was setting and called a contractor I'd worked with before, someone I trusted to handle unusual jobs without asking too many questions. Martin showed up the next morning with his tools and a crew of 2, ready to do whatever renovation work the house needed before I could sell it or rent it out. I showed him the basement, explained I wanted to understand the structure before making decisions about the property, and watched his expression shift from professional interest to barely concealed discomfort as he examined the space. The shelves were hand-built, he said, old-growth timber that would cost a fortune to replicate today, and the preservation work was meticulous, almost obsessive in its attention to detail. Then Martin found the symbols carved into the floor joists, marks that predated the house's construction based on the wood aging patterns, and his crew refused to continue working. The symbols weren't decorative. They were precise geometric patterns that repeated across every structural element with mathematical consistency. And they looked old, really old, older than the timber itself somehow. Martin took photos with his phone, said he'd need to research before providing an estimate, and I didn't hear from him for 3 days. When he finally called back, his voice carried an edge I'd never heard before, tension that suggested he'd learned something he wished he hadn't. He said he couldn't take the job, couldn't explain why, but strongly recommended I contact the Historical Society or maybe an anthropologist before doing anything else to the property. I spent that week researching my grandmother's history, digging through county records and old newspapers and church archives, looking for any indication she'd been involved in something unusual. What I found was a pattern stretching back generations, a keeping tradition that certain families in the area maintained, though the records never specified what exactly they were keeping or why. My great-grandfather had performed similar work on the same property, and his father before him, a lineage of caretakers who documented their activities with the same meticulous precision my grandmother had shown. The tradition required specific actions on new moon nights, rituals that involved walking the property boundaries and collecting whatever had manifested since the previous cycle. and failure to maintain the tradition resulted in consequences the records described only as unfortunate events. August 23rd was a new moon, and I'd missed the ritual date while dealing with funeral arrangements and estate paperwork. I didn't think much of it until the morning of August 25th, when Skyla from the neighboring property called to report that 7 of her chickens had died overnight, just dropped dead in their coop, with no signs of injury or illness. Then the farm 2 properties over lost a cow, healthy one day, and stone dead the next, with eyes that had turned milky white and organs that the veterinarian said looked like they'd been preserved while the animal was still alive. By August 27th, livestock deaths had occurred on 5 properties surrounding my grandmother's land, forming a perfect circle with her house at the center, and people were starting to ask questions I couldn't answer. I went back to the basement and found my grandmother's journals hidden behind the mason jars, leather-bound books filled with 70 years of observations and instructions. The property sat on top of something, she wrote, something that predated human settlement in the region by thousands of years, and the keeping tradition wasn't superstition or folklore, but necessary containment. Whatever existed beneath the land had to be regularly appeased through specific rituals that involved collecting its manifestations and preserving them in sealed containers, preventing the influence from spreading beyond the property boundaries. My great-great-grandfather had discovered this in 1898, when he'd attempted to clear the land without performing the rituals, and the resulting deaths had included his wife and 2 children before he understood what was required. The journals included detailed instructions, step-by-step procedures for the new moon rituals, and warnings about what happened when the tradition lapsed. The manifestations would increase in size and frequency, spreading outward from the property in concentric circles, affecting livestock first, then pets, then eventually people. The 1944 incident my great-grandfather had caused resulted in 3 human deaths before he resumed the rituals. Deaths that were officially attributed to various natural causes, but the journals documented as direct consequences of broken containment. I read everything twice, trying to find some indication my grandmother had been delusional or confused, but the precision of her observations and the accuracy of her predictions about what would happen if rituals were missed suggested she'd been documenting something real, something that required belief or disbelief didn't matter because it would continue existing regardless. The next new moon was September 21st, 4 weeks away, and I had to decide whether to continue a tradition that sounded insane or risk discovering my grandmother had been right about everything. I started walking the property boundaries at dawn and dusk, learning the landmarks she documented, finding the spots where manifestations typically occurred. The northwest corner near the old oak tree was particularly active, she'd written, especially during autumn months, and I should expect to find multiple specimens there. Each cycle, I brought mason jars and preservation fluid I'd ordered online after researching her methods, feeling ridiculous and terrified in equal measure, and on September 20th, I prepared to perform my first ritual, following instructions that read like something from a horror novel, but were written in my grandmother's steady handwriting with the same practical tone she'd used to teach me how to change a tire. The ritual was simple in execution, but disturbing in implication. Walk the boundaries clockwise starting at sunset, carrying empty jars and a lantern, watching for movement or growth that didn't belong. Collect whatever manifested, seal it immediately without extended observation, label with date and location, store in the basement with all the others. The journals warned against trying to study the specimens too closely, against attempting to understand their nature or origin, because comprehension itself could be dangerous. Just collect, preserve, maintain the containment, and accept that some knowledge is better left unexamined. I found 3 manifestations that night, things that looked almost like mushrooms, except they pulsed with internal light, and retreated from my lantern before I could collect them. and something that might have been an insect if insects had too many legs and wings that existed in more dimensions than I could properly perceive. I sealed them in jars with hands that shook so badly I nearly dropped the first one, and by the time I completed the boundary walk, I was soaked in sweat despite the cool night air, and my jaw ached from clenching my teeth. The basement accepted the new jars without comment, and I added them to shelves that now felt less like a disturbing collection and more like a necessary archive. Evidence of containment that had protected the surrounding community for generations. No livestock died that cycle. No unexplained deaths, no mysterious illnesses, nothing unusual beyond the unsettling reality that I'd successfully performed a ritual that shouldn't work, but apparently did. I've continued the tradition for 9 years now, performing the boundary walks every new moon, collecting manifestations that defy biological classification, preserving them in mason jars that line basement shelves in my grandmother's house that I can never sell or abandon. The property is mine now, in the same way it was hers, bound through obligation and terrible knowledge that some places require caretakers, and some traditions exist because the alternative is worse than the superstition. I tried to stop once in 2018, convinced I'd been indoctrinated into family delusion, and the livestock deaths had been coincidence or disease. I skipped 3 cycles, 3 new moons, where I didn't walk the boundaries or collect anything, and by the 4th month, 2 dogs and a horse had died on neighboring properties, while Skyla reported seeing things in her peripheral vision that disappeared when she looked directly at them. I resumed the rituals immediately, and the deaths stopped, and I've never missed a cycle since, because I know now what my grandmother spent 70 years protecting everyone from, what my family has maintained for over a century, while the rest of the community went about their lives unaware that the land itself requires constant vigilance. The manifestations change with seasons and lunar cycles, sometimes small enough to fit in pint jars, sometimes requiring gallon containers I have to special order. They're never the same twice, never follow patterns I can predict, and I've learned not to examine them too closely or think too hard about what they might be or where they come from. The basement holds thousands of specimens now, decades of collected manifestations sealed in preservative fluid, and sometimes late at night I hear them moving on their shelves, glass clinking against glass in rhythms that feel almost intentional. This is my inheritance, my burden, my responsibility to something that existed here long before humans built houses on these hills, and will exist long after we're gone. I'm a keeper now, maintaining tradition that keeps whatever lives beneath this land from spreading into the world beyond property lines my great-great-grandfather established when he learned the hard way that some ground demands respect and regular appeasement. What would you sacrifice to protect your community from something they don't even know exists? Drop your thoughts below. My name is Brady, and I've worked night audit at the Mountain View Inn in Bluefield, West Virginia since November 2021. The graveyard shift from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. where I'm alone in the lobby processing reservations and balancing accounts while the rest of the world sleeps. The hotel isn't fancy, just a 2-story building off Route 460 that caters mostly to truckers and salespeople passing through. 68 rooms that rarely fill to capacity except during summer tourist season. I'd been working security before this, overnight shifts at a warehouse, so the isolation didn't bother me, and the pay was decent enough to cover rent and groceries with enough left over for the online classes I was taking to finish my degree. Room 214 was just another room for the first 6 months. Nothing special about it. Standard double bed and bathroom and furniture that had been replaced sometime in the 90s and never updated. The first time I noticed something unusual was April 2022, a Tuesday morning around 5 a.m. when I was doing my final walkthrough before the breakfast staff arrived. Room 214's door was propped open, housekeeping cart visible in the hallway, which seemed wrong because housekeeping didn't start until 8, and our overnight guests rarely checked out before 6. I knocked and called out, got no response, and stepped inside to find the room immaculate, bed made with hospital corners, bathroom scrubbed, towels folded exactly the way our housekeeping supervisor insisted they be displayed. But the registration system showed 214 as vacant, had shown it vacant for 3 days, and there was no housekeeping cart in the hallway when I looked again, just empty corridor and the persistent smell of industrial cleaning solution. I checked the security footage later, reviewing the hallway camera that covered 214's door, and saw nothing unusual. No housekeeping staff, no guests, no door opening or closing, just static hallway for the entire shift. But I knew I'd seen that room cleaned, knew I'd smelled the bleach and seen the perfectly made bed, and the discrepancy bothered me enough that I started paying attention to tune specifically during my nightly rounds. 3 nights later, it happened again. Doors standing open at 4:17 a.m. showing a freshly serviced room that our system insisted was vacant and had been vacant for a week. This time I took photos with my phone before the door swung shut on its own, and when I reviewed the images later, they showed an empty room with an unmade bed and yesterday's newspaper on the nightstand. Nothing like what I'd seen with my own eyes. May brought escalation. Room 214 required housekeeping attention every single morning, despite never showing occupancy in our reservation system, and the housekeeping supervisor started asking me why I kept reporting it as needing service. I tried explaining what I observed during night audit, but the day shift saw only a vacant room that had been vacant for weeks, and eventually they stopped responding to my maintenance requests because they thought I was either pranking them or losing my grip on reality. I started documenting everything, times and observations and photographs that never showed what I actually witnessed, building a file that proved nothing except the growing gap between what I experienced and what evidence suggested was true. The personal items started appearing in June. Reading glasses on the nightstand, prescription bottles in the bathroom, a wristwatch on the dresser, all items that shouldn't exist in a vacant room, but were definitely there when I checked at 3:47 a.m. during my standard rounds. I photographed everything, documented the prescription labels showing medications dispensed in 2003, noted the watch had stopped at 8:22, though I couldn't tell if that was AM or PM. I researched the room's history through our ancient filing system and found that a guest had died in 214 back in August 2003, natural causes according to the incident report, a traveling salesman who checked in for 3 nights and died in his sleep on the 2nd night. The items I was finding matched the inventory list from that incident, belongings that should have been claimed by family or disposed of 19 years ago, but were appearing fresh and current, as if they'd been placed there yesterday. I stopped sleeping well. The isolation that hadn't bothered me before started feeling oppressive, and the hotel's nighttime sounds became sinister, every settling creak and HVAC hum suggesting presence where there should be none. I'd see movement in my peripheral vision, quick flickers at the edge of awareness that vanished when I turned to look directly. The movements always happened at the end of hallways, always positioned so I could never quite focus on them, and they always seemed to be facing away from me, standing motionless at the far end of whatever corridor I was walking. I told myself it was fatigue, the brain creating patterns from insufficient sleep and too much caffeine, but the feeling of being watched intensified until I dreaded my nightly rounds and started finding excuses to stay behind the front desk. July 6th brought the notebook. I found it in the desk drawer in my workspace behind the front desk, a composition book with a black and white marbled cover that I'd never seen before. Inside were my own observations about room 214, written in handwriting that looked similar to mine but wasn't quite identical, details I'd noticed but never written down. The entries started in November 2021, my first week on the job, and continued through events that hadn't happened yet. Observations dated weeks into the future, describing things I would notice about 214's behavior. I read 3 months ahead, saw myself documenting the same patterns and progressions, and felt something cold settle in my chest as I realized I was reading a script I was apparently meant to follow. The entries described my growing obsession with the room, detailed how I'd start staying late after my shift to watch 214's door, predicted I'd begin experiencing insomnia and anxiety and the peripheral vision phenomena I'd been dismissing as fatigue. Everything I'd experienced was documented in that notebook in handwriting that could have been mine if I'd written it while distracted or tired, and the future entries suggested things would get worse. August entries described hearing my own voice coming from inside 214 when I knew the room was empty. September predicted I'd start finding personal items that belonged to me but that I'd never lost. And October's final entry simply read, "Thank you for noticing. Most people don't anymore." I tried to throw the notebook away, stuffed it in the dumpster behind the hotel during my break, but it was back in the desk drawer the next night, open to the current date's entry. I burned it in the parking lot, watched the pages curl and blacken, but found it again perfectly intact the following shift. The notebook wanted to be read, wanted me to know what was coming, and I couldn't escape it any more than I could escape the observation. The 214 was trying to communicate something through its impossible cleanliness and phantom occupants and items that existed in contradictory states of being both present and absent. On my last shift before quitting, October 31st, 2022, I found a note in the notebook I hadn't written, positioned where the next blank page should be. The handwriting was definitely not mine, more precise and controlled, and it thanked me for noticing the room's patterns, for paying attention when other night auditors had dismissed the anomalies as equipment malfunction or sleep deprivation. The note explained that 214 existed slightly out of phase with normal time, that the guest who died there in 2003 had somehow anchored part of the room to his timeline, and that my observations had helped stabilize something the note didn't fully explain. It said most night auditors never noticed the patterns, never saw the cleaned room, or the personal items, or the movements at hallway ends, and my attention had been valuable in ways I wouldn't understand. I quit the next day, gave 2 weeks' notice, and worked my final shifts in mounting dread, but nothing else unusual happened. Room 214 stayed vacant in the system and looked vacant when I checked it. No more phantom housekeeping or impossible items, just a normal room that happened to have been the site of a death 19 years prior. The notebook disappeared from the desk drawer on my final shift, and when I checked the security footage one last time, I saw something that made my hands shake. The camera covering 214's hallway showed a figure standing at the far end of the corridor during every single shift I'd worked there, always facing away, always positioned just at the edge of the frame. The figure wore clothes from 2003, carried a salesman's briefcase, and never moved during the hours of footage I reviewed, just stood there watching without watching, present without being present. I work at a gas station now, day shift where the sun comes through the windows and customers provide constant distraction from thoughts I don't want to think. I don't work nights anymore, can't handle the isolation and the peripheral vision shadows and the feeling that some spaces exist in multiple timelines simultaneously. The Mountain View Inn still operates, still books room 214 to unsuspecting guests, and I wonder sometimes if the current night auditor has noticed the patterns, or if I was unique in my ability to perceive the overlap. The notebook predicted I'd quit in October and move to daytime work, predicted I'd develop an aversion to night shifts and isolation, and every prediction has proven accurate so far. I don't know what I helped stabilize by noticing room 214's temporal displacement, don't know if my observations made things better or worse, or if they mattered at all beyond satisfying some entity's need to be perceived and acknowledged. Sometimes I drive past the Mountain View Inn late at night, can't help myself, and I always look up at the second floor where 214's window sits dark and empty, except it's not always empty. Sometimes there's a light on, even though the reservation system shows the room vacant. And once I saw a figure standing at the window, looking down at the parking lot with posture that suggested waiting or watching, or maybe just existing in a space that doesn't quite align with ours. I never stop when I see the light. Never go inside to check if the night audit desk still has a notebook documenting observations that haven't been made yet. Just keep driving and try to convince myself that some mysteries are better left unexamined. The peripheral vision movements followed me, though, manifesting in my new job and my apartment, and anywhere I'm alone long enough for my brain to start creating patterns. I see figures at the end of aisles at the gas station, standing motionless and facing away, and they vanish when I look directly but return when my attention drifts. I don't know if 214 marked me somehow, tuned my perception to detect temporal overlaps and phase displacements, or if I was always sensitive to these things and working night audit just awakened capabilities I'd been suppressing. The notebook's final entry, the one I read on my last shift, suggested I'd continue experiencing these phenomena regardless of employment or location, that once you notice the spaces where timelines blur, you can never fully stop noticing. I don't write anything down anymore, don't document my observations or take photographs that will show something different than what I witnessed. I just notice and acknowledge and move on, accepting that reality is more recursive and layered than most people perceive, and that some of us are cursed or blessed with the ability to see where the layers separate and overlap. Room 214 taught me that the past doesn't always stay past, that spaces can retain impressions of their occupants in ways that violate our understanding of how time works, and that paying attention to impossibilities can trap you in recursive loops where your observations become part of what you're observing. The salesman who died in 2003 is still there, in some sense, still checking in for a 3-night stay that never ends, and I helped anchor his timeline by noticing it, by documenting his presence in a notebook that exists outside normal causation. Think about the last time you stayed in a hotel room. Did you ever wonder who was there before you, or what impressions they might have left behind? My name is Casey, and I've been a nurse practitioner at Appalachian Community Health in Grundy, Virginia, since graduating in 2009, treating everything from diabetes complications to work injuries in a town where the coal mines closed years ago but left their mark on everyone's lungs and joints. February 2012 brought ice storms that knocked out power for days at a time, and that's when the mobile clinic showed up. A white medical trailer that parked in the lot behind the closed elementary school and offered free health screenings to anyone who walked through the door. They called themselves Mountain Wellness Initiative, claimed to be funded by a foundation out of Richmond, and their paperwork looked legitimate enough that nobody questioned their presence or their motives until it was already too late. I first noticed the pattern in early March when 3 patients came to my clinic within the same week, complaining of identical symptoms that hadn't appeared in their previous medical histories. Headaches centered behind the left eye, metallic taste that wouldn't go away no matter what they ate or drank, and a persistent low-grade fever that hovered right at 99.8 degrees without ever climbing higher or dropping to normal. All 3 had visited the Mountain Wellness Initiative trailer within the previous month. All 3 had participated in what they described as voluntary health studies that involved blood draws and oral medication samples, and all 3 showed the same unusual protein marker in their blood work that I'd never encountered in 15 years of reviewing lab results. The protein signature didn't match anything in the standard database, wasn't associated with any known disease or metabolic process, and appeared in concentrations high enough to suggest recent introduction rather than naturally occurring biological function. I ran the test 3 times thinking equipment malfunction or contamination, but the results remained consistent, and when I expanded my review to include other recent patients, I found 7 more showing the identical marker. Every single one had visited the mobile clinic. Every single one had participated in their voluntary studies. And none of them had been informed they were part of any kind of experimental research that might introduce novel proteins into their bloodstream. I contacted the Virginia Department of Health on March 15th, filed a formal inquiry about the Mountain Wellness Initiative and their activities in Grundy, and received a response within 48 hours that made my stomach drop. The health department had no record of any organization by that name. No permits had been issued for mobile health services in our county, and the foundation they claimed funded their work didn't exist in any state or federal registry. I drove to the elementary school lot that afternoon expecting to find the trailer gone, evidence destroyed, but it was still there, still accepting patients, and the staff acted completely unconcerned when I walked in asking questions about their authorization and research protocols. The woman at the intake desk, professional and polite, explained they were conducting observational studies on health outcomes in underserved Appalachian populations, all completely voluntary, with full informed consent from participants. She showed me release forms signed by my patients, documents that mentioned blood collection and vitamin supplementation, but said nothing about experimental proteins or novel pharmaceutical compounds. When I asked specifically about the medication samples, she claimed they were standard multivitamin formulations approved by the FDA and distributed regularly in public health initiatives. Everything she said sounded reasonable, completely above board, but the protein markers in my patient's blood work told a different story, and the absence of any official records about the organization suggested something far more concerning than unauthorized vitamin distribution. I escalated to the state medical board, filed complaints with every regulatory agency I could identify, and within a week received a certified letter threatening suspension of my nursing license for making unfounded accusations against a legitimate public health organization. The letter came from a law firm in D.C., not Richmond, and referenced specific details about my professional history that shouldn't have been accessible to anyone outside the state licensing board. They knew about a malpractice complaint from 2010 that had been dismissed, knew about my student loan debt and my mother's ongoing cancer treatment, knew things that suggested they'd been researching me specifically in preparation for exactly this kind of pushback. The patients started experiencing delayed effects in April. The headaches intensified, migrating from behind the eye to encompass the entire left hemisphere, and the metallic taste evolved into something they described as tasting colors or hearing textures, synesthetic experiences that suggested neurological changes beyond normal sensory processing. Memory gaps appeared, hours disappearing from their recollection with no explanation, and personality shifts that family members noticed but patients couldn't perceive in themselves. One woman who'd been quiet and reserved her entire life started exhibiting aggression that resulted in a domestic violence call, and when I examined her, I found scarring on her internal organs visible through ultrasound imaging that hadn't existed in her baseline scans from 6 months prior. The scarring was the most disturbing evidence because it appeared in patterns too regular to be natural, geometric arrangements of tissue damage that looked almost intentional, and it manifested in locations that made no anatomical sense. Liver scarring that extended into the diaphragm in straight lines, kidney damage that formed perfect circles, intestinal lesions arranged in what looked almost like written symbols if you tilted your head and let your eyes unfocus. I documented everything with photographs and detailed medical records, built a case file that should have triggered immediate investigation, but every agency I contacted either ignored my reports or responded with legal threats suggesting I was harassing a beneficial public health initiative. The mobile clinic evacuated overnight on May 3rd, disappeared between sunset and dawn without leaving forwarding information or contact details. The elementary school lot was empty when I drove past on my way to work. just oil stains on the asphalt and disturbed gravel where the trailer had been parked for 3 months. I called the number from their intake paperwork and got a disconnected message, searched for their website, and found the domain had been abandoned. Tried to track down any of the staff I'd interacted with, and discovered none of them appeared in any professional licensing databases or social media platforms. I collected the medical waste they'd left behind, dumpsters that should have been emptied but hadn't been, and found biological material that environmental testing showed contained genetic material from multiple species. Not just human and animal, but things that didn't match any reference sequences in the genetic databases. Organisms that either didn't exist in nature or had never been cataloged by science. The waste included used syringes and medication vials with labels that matched the vitamin supplements they'd claimed to distribute. But analysis showed the contents were pharmaceutical compounds that hadn't been approved for human trials, experimental formulations that combined elements of immunotherapy and neural modification in ways that suggested someone was testing cutting-edge medical technology on vulnerable populations without oversight or informed consent. I testified before a state health subcommittee in June, presented all my evidence and documentation, and watched politicians who should have been outraged instead ask why I was wasting state resources investigating a program that had provided free health services to underserved communities. The pharmaceutical compounds were dismissed as measurement error, the unusual protein markers explained as natural variation in Appalachian populations that hadn't been properly studied, and the geometric scarring attributed to my own bias, seeing patterns where none existed. The hearing concluded with recommendations that I undergo psychiatric evaluation to ensure I was fit to continue practicing, and I left understanding that whatever the Mountain Wellness Initiative had been doing in Grundy, it had protection at levels far above county or state authority. The patients I'd been monitoring showed continued deterioration through summer and fall. The synesthetic experiences became permanent, people tasting sounds and hearing colors as their neural pathways rewired into configurations that shouldn't be survivable, and the memory gaps expanded until some patients lost entire weeks with no recollection of their activities or whereabouts. The geometric scarring progressed, new patterns appearing on organs throughout their bodies, and I started noticing that the patterns matched between patients, identical symbols manifesting in identical locations, as if whatever was growing inside them followed a predetermined template. I cross-referenced the scarring patterns with every database I could access, looking for matches in medical literature or historical records, and found similar documentation from a clinical trial conducted in 1986 in rural Kentucky. The trial had been shut down after 3 months amid allegations of unauthorized experimentation, and the pharmaceutical company behind it had dissolved in 1989, showing no assets and no successor organization. But the scarring patterns, photographed in 1986, matched exactly what I was seeing in 2012, suggesting either someone had revived that research, or the same group had been operating continuously for decades under different corporate shells and organizational names. I couldn't prove any of it. The evidence I'd collected was dismissed as either contaminated or misinterpreted. The patient's symptoms explained through conventional diagnoses that ignored the unusual protein markers and geometric scarring, and my continued investigation resulted in professional sanctions that prevented me from accessing certain medical databases and required supervision for any research activities. The pharmaceutical company that supposedly didn't exist had enough legal power to threaten my license and enough connections to influence state health officials. And I learned the hard way that some organizations operate beyond normal oversight because they have protection from entities that benefit from their research regardless of ethical considerations. I still practice in Grundy, still see the patients who participated in the Mountain Wellness Initiative studies, and I watch them transform into something that medicine doesn't have language to describe. Their bodies continue changing according to patterns I can't decode. Their minds rewire into configurations that produce experiences beyond normal human perception. And I document everything knowing the documentation will never result in accountability or justice. The mobile clinic was conducting unauthorized human trials on vulnerable populations, introducing experimental compounds that modify biology at fundamental levels. And when they'd collected sufficient data, they evacuated and moved to the next location where regulatory oversight is weak and populations are desperate enough to accept free health services without questioning the provider's motivations. Somewhere out there, the Mountain Wellness Initiative operates under a new name in a different underserved community, offering free screenings and voluntary studies that transform participants into experimental subjects for research that's too controversial or dangerous for legitimate channels. They'll stay until someone notices the patterns, like I did, then they'll evacuate overnight and resurface elsewhere, protected by legal structures and political connections that allow them to operate with impunity. My patients remain living evidence of what happens when medical ethics become optional and human bodies become raw material for research that pushes boundaries regardless of consequences. And I carry the weight of knowing I documented their transformation, but couldn't prevent or reverse it. If someone offered you free medical care, but you later learned it was part of an unauthorized experiment, would you want to know the truth or prefer to remain unaware? My name is Shepard, and I operate heavy equipment for demolition contracts throughout West Virginia, running excavators and backhoes that tear down what people no longer need or can no longer maintain. July 2008 brought work to Man, a town barely clinging to existence after the coal industry collapsed, and the job was straightforward enough on paper. Dismantle an abandoned processing facility that had been sitting empty since the mid-90s. Clear the site. Prepare it for whatever development might eventually replace the rust and concrete. I'd demolished dozens of industrial sites before, understood the rhythms of structural collapse and debris removal, but this facility felt wrong from the moment I drove my excavator through the chain-link fence that first morning, when fog still hung thick enough to obscure the building's upper floors. The facility sprawled across maybe 8 acres, a maze of corrugated metal buildings and concrete foundations connected by conveyor systems that had transported coal from arrival to processing to shipment back when the operation was running. Most of the equipment had been stripped for scrap years earlier, leaving skeletal frames and empty rooms that echoed when I walked through during my initial site assessment. My contract specified overnight work to minimize traffic disruption, which meant I'd be alone on site from 8 p.m. to 6 a.m. running machinery that could pulverize concrete and shear through steel support beams. The isolation didn't concern me. I preferred working nights anyway, but something about the facility's geography bothered me in ways I couldn't articulate, spaces that felt larger inside than their external dimensions suggested, and corridors that seemed to lead nowhere, but somehow connected to everywhere. The ground-penetrating radar on my excavator detected the void on my third night, July 17th, at approximately 11:47 p.m. when I was breaking up the main processing building's foundation. The equipment uses sonic waves to map subsurface structures, helps identify utility lines and underground tanks before you accidentally rupture something expensive or dangerous. And the readout showed a massive hollow space beneath the facility that extended far beyond the building's footprint. I marked the location and spent the next hour mapping the void's dimensions, discovering it stretched nearly 200 feet in diameter and descended at least 50 feet below grade, a cavern that geological surveys should have identified before the facility was ever built, but somehow hadn't appeared in any of the site documentation. I reported the finding to my supervisor, who contacted the property owner, who insisted no subsurface voids existed on the site, and I should continue demolition according to the original plan. But I've been operating equipment long enough to trust my instruments over assurances from people who aren't present. So I spent that night carefully excavating around the area where the void's ceiling should be weakest, removing layers of foundation and soil until my bucket broke through into darkness that my excavator's work lights couldn't fully penetrate. The opening released air that smelled like machine oil and ozone, and something organic that reminded me of the deer I'd hit with my truck 2 years prior. The smell of biology breaking down in ways that weren't entirely natural. I climbed down into the void the next night, brought proper lighting and safety equipment despite knowing I should probably call in specialists to assess whatever I'd uncovered. The space was partially natural cave formation and partially excavated chamber. Walls showing tool marks that suggested intentional expansion of an existing geological feature. Industrial equipment filled the cavern, machinery that didn't match anything used in coal processing, devices with purposes I couldn't identify even after examining them closely, pressure vessels connected to filtration systems that fed into what looked like isolation chambers, all of it arranged around a central platform that held monitoring equipment from the 80s, based on the computer terminals and analog gauges. I found the supervisor's office built into the cavern wall, a concrete room with a steel door that opened when I pushed, because the lock mechanism had rusted through decades of disuse. Inside were filing cabinets full of logs documenting something called behavioral research conducted between 1986 and 1989. Observations about night shift workers experiencing what the logs described as time displacement events. The entries were clinical, detached, noting that workers would report arriving for their 8-hour shift and leaving after what felt like normal duration. But machinery logs and time cards would show they'd been on site for 16 or 20 hours, with no memory of the additional time. The research focused on productivity metrics, measuring output during these displacement events and comparing it to normal shift performance. Workers produced double or triple their usual output during the missing hours, operated equipment with precision that exceeded their documented skill levels, and showed no fatigue or awareness that anything unusual had occurred. The logs tracked this phenomenon across 47 different workers over 3 years, documented the progression from occasional displacement events to regular occurrences that eventually affected the entire night shift crew, and noted with scientific precision the point at which workers stopped going home between shifts, because they no longer perceived the passage of time accurately enough to know when their shifts ended. I sat in that underground office, reading logs that described human beings transformed into tireless machines who worked continuously without rest or awareness. And I felt my skin crawl with the understanding that someone had been conducting unauthorized experiments on workers who thought they were just operating coal processing equipment. The final entries from August 1989 documented the abrupt termination of research, equipment deactivation, and facility closure, with notes about sealing the underground chamber and destroying all surface evidence of the project's existence. But they hadn't destroyed the logs, hadn't removed the equipment, just buried it under a new foundation and left it waiting for someone like me to accidentally discover it decades later. I climbed back to the surface, planning to document everything and report it to authorities who might actually investigate what had happened here. But my excavator's instrument panel was showing readings that made no sense. The hour meter displayed 847 hours of operation since I'd started this job, but I'd only been on site for 6 nights working 8-hour shifts, which should total maybe 50 hours maximum. The fuel consumption log showed I'd burned through 340 gallons of diesel, far more than the tank capacity and completely inconsistent with the refueling schedule I'd been maintaining. Temperature gauges that should read engine heat were showing absolute zero, negative 273 degrees Celsius, a temperature that would shatter metal and freeze diesel solid, but somehow my equipment was running normally. I checked my phone for the time and found I'd been on site for what my body's hunger and fatigue suggested was maybe 3 hours, but the timestamp showed 4:17 a.m., almost 8 hours since I'd arrived at 8 p.m. I had no memory of the missing time, no recollection of operating my equipment or conducting demolition work, but the site showed significant progress. Foundations demolished that I didn't remember touching, and debris piled in locations I hadn't planned. My water bottle was empty, though I remembered filling it during my break around 10, and my hands showed blisters from gripping controls for extended periods despite the gloves I always wore. The pattern continued every night for the next week. I'd arrive at 8 p.m., begin work on demolition tasks I'd planned during daylight hours, and then experience gaps where hours disappeared and work progressed far beyond what should have been possible in the time I could account for. My equipment logs became increasingly bizarre, hour meters jumping forward in increments that violated mechanical possibility, fuel consumption rates that exceeded tank capacity, temperature readings that cycled between extremes that should destroy the machinery, but somehow didn't. I started arriving earlier and leaving later, trying to catch the displacement events as they occurred, but the gaps just expanded to fill whatever time I made available, and I'd find myself standing beside my excavator at dawn with no memory of how the night had passed. The worst realization came when I discovered I'd been dreaming in languages I didn't speak, waking up with words on my tongue that sounded like Russian, or maybe German, or possibly something else entirely. The dreams showed me operating equipment in facilities I'd never visited, demolishing structures that didn't exist in any geography I recognized, working alongside crews of people whose faces I couldn't quite focus on, but whose presence felt familiar in ways that suggested I'd known them for years. I'd wake up exhausted despite sleeping 8 hours, my muscles aching like I'd been doing physical labor all night, and I'd find dirt under my fingernails and concrete dust in my hair, even though I'd showered before bed. Aiden worked day shift on the same site, handled debris removal and site cleanup while I conducted overnight demolition, and when I finally worked up the courage to ask if he'd noticed anything unusual about the facility, he looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. He said the site always looked further along than he expected when he arrived each morning, demolition progressing faster than any single operator should accomplish in 8 hours, and sometimes he'd find equipment positioned in locations that would require hours to move but showed no tracks or disturbance in the surrounding soil. He'd stopped questioning it because the work was getting done and the client was happy with progress, but he admitted the site made him uncomfortable in ways he couldn't articulate. I showed him the underground chamber and the supervisor's logs, explained what I'd learned about the behavioral research and time displacement events, and watched his face go pale as he recognized the pattern manifesting in our current work. We were experiencing the same phenomenon the 80s workers had experienced, losing hours to some effect generated by the equipment in that sealed chamber, and our productivity was exceeding normal human capacity because we were working through time we couldn't consciously access or remember. Aiden wanted to quit immediately, walk away from the contract, and let someone else finish the demolition, but I convinced him we needed to complete the job specifically to destroy whatever was causing the displacement events. We spent the next 2 weeks methodically dismantling the underground equipment, cutting apart the pressure vessels and isolation chambers and monitoring systems, hauling everything to the surface and shipping it to scrap yards in 3 different states so it couldn't be reassembled. The time displacement events continued throughout the demolition, but with decreasing intensity as we removed more equipment. And by the time we'd cleared the last component, I was only losing maybe an hour per shift instead of the 4 or 5 that had become routine. The facility was razed completely by early August, every structure demolished and every piece of underground equipment destroyed, and the site looked like nothing except an empty lot waiting for redevelopment. But something changed in me during those weeks of working through time I couldn't account for, operating equipment in states of consciousness I couldn't access or control. My watch runs 9 minutes slow every single day now, loses time at a consistent rate that watch repair specialists can't explain or correct, and I've replaced it 4 times with identical results. I dream in those unknown languages every night. Wake up speaking words I don't understand, but that feel significant somehow. And sometimes I find myself in locations with no memory of how I got there, or how much time passed during the journey. The displacement events followed me home, integrated into my daily life, and I exist now in a state of perpetual temporal uncertainty where I'm never quite sure how much time has actually elapsed versus how much time I've experienced. Aiden moved to Ohio 6 months after we finished the man facility demolition, changed careers entirely, and refuses to discuss what happened during those weeks when we were losing hours to equipment that shouldn't have been able to affect human perception of time. I still operate heavy equipment, still take demolition contracts throughout the state, but I avoid overnight work now, and I never accept jobs at industrial sites built before 1990 because I know too much about what might be buried beneath their foundations. The behavioral research from 1986 to 1989 wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of something larger that used industrial facilities as cover for experiments that treated human consciousness like a resource to be exploited and optimized. Somewhere in my missing hours, I learned things I can't consciously access, operated in states of awareness that my waking mind can't process, and those experiences left traces that manifest as slow watches and dreams in foreign languages, and gaps in my daily timeline that I've learned to accept as my new normal. The facility in Man is gone now, demolished completely, but whatever it was studying or generating didn't disappear with the equipment destruction. It just distributed itself among the workers who'd been exposed to its effects for long enough to be permanently altered. I carry time displacement with me everywhere I go, 9 minutes slow per day that accumulates into hours and days and eventually weeks of missing experience that I'm living through without conscious awareness, working and speaking and existing in dimensions of time that my baseline consciousness can't perceive or remember. When you lose track of time doing something you enjoy, does it ever feel like more time passed than you can account for, or less? What's the longest you've ever lost? My name is Baker, and I've worked as a hydrologist for the West Virginia Department of Environmental Protection since 2018, testing groundwater quality and tracking contamination sources throughout the state's complex network of aquifers and underground rivers. September 2023 brought me to Summers County, where private well owners were reporting water that smelled wrong, tasted metallic, and caused chemical burns when it contacted skin for more than a few seconds. The complaints centered around a rural area near Hinton, where maybe 30 families relied on wells drilled into the same water table. And my initial assumption was standard industrial contamination, runoff from old mining operations or illegal dumping that had finally reached residential depth after years of gradual infiltration. The first well I tested belonged to Malcolm, a retired machinist who'd lived on his property for 40 years and never experienced water quality issues until early September, when his morning shower left blistering rashes across his shoulders and back. The water coming from his tap looked clear, no visible particulates or discoloration, but it smelled like something alive, organic decay mixed with minerals, and a sharp chemical edge that made my eyes water when I leaned close to collect samples. Standard field tests showed pH levels within normal range, no heavy metals at concentrations that would explain the burning, and bacterial counts actually lower than expected for well water in this region. But there was something else present. Organic compounds my portable analyzer couldn't identify, molecular structures that didn't match anything in the contamination database I'd been using for 5 years. I collected samples from 7 wells that first day, mapped their locations, and noticed they formed a pattern that looked almost geometric, points on a circle roughly 2 miles in diameter, with a center point that fell on abandoned property where a resort hotel had operated briefly in the 70s. The hotel had attempted experimental geothermal heating, drilled deep into bedrock trying to tap thermal energy for an innovative climate control system, but the project was terminated abruptly in 1974, and all records sealed under circumstances the county archives couldn't or wouldn't explain. The drilling site was still visible if you knew where to look. A concrete cap covering the borehole and warning signs faded to illegibility after 50 years of weather exposure. I spent 2 weeks analyzing the water samples in the state lab, running tests that should have identified every possible contaminant, and the results were consistent across all 7 wells, but completely baffling in their implications. The organic compounds present in the water didn't match any known biological source, showed molecular arrangements that suggested they were alive or had been alive recently, and contained amino acid sequences that didn't appear in any terrestrial organism we'd cataloged. The compounds were complex, almost like proteins, but structured in ways that violated rules about how organic chemistry functions at normal temperatures and pressures, and they were present in concentrations high enough to suggest active production rather than passive contamination from historical sources. I submitted my findings to the regional supervisor expecting immediate escalation and emergency response, but instead received instructions to conduct additional testing and avoid alarming residents until we had definitive answers about contamination sources and health risks. The delay felt wrong. Administrative caution prioritizing bureaucratic procedure over public safety. But I didn't have authority to issue warnings without departmental approval, so I continued testing and expanded my investigation to include geological surveys of the area surrounding the old hotel drilling site. Core samples from around the sealed borehole contained fossilized organic matter that carbon dating placed at depths inconsistent with its age, material that should have been millions of years older based on the strata it was found in, or millions of years younger, depending on which dating method you trusted. The fossilized material showed structural similarities to the living compounds contaminating the well water, suggesting a connection between whatever had been discovered during the 1974 geothermal drilling and the current contamination event. I requested access to the sealed records from the hotel's drilling project, filed formal requests through channels that should have produced results within weeks, but encountered resistance at every level. The records were classified for reasons related to national security, I was told, or they'd been destroyed in a fire, or they never existed in the first place, depending on which agency representative I spoke with. The inconsistent explanation suggested someone was actively preventing access, and the more I pushed for information, the more pushback I received. Residents who'd been drinking the contaminated water before the smell became noticeable enough to stop them started reporting unusual symptoms in October. Dreams that felt more vivid than waking life, sensations of movement through spaces that didn't correspond to physical locations, and persistent awareness of being underground, even when they were clearly above ground in their homes or vehicles. Malcolm described it as feeling like he was swimming through earth, his body moving through soil and rock as easily as moving through water, and he could taste minerals he'd never encountered, elements he couldn't name but somehow recognized as fundamental components of planetary formation. Other affected residents reported similar experiences, dream state awareness of geological processes, and deep time perspectives that made their normal human consciousness feel like a temporary aberration rather than their baseline state. The dreams weren't random or individual, they were shared experiences where multiple residents reported identical imagery and sensations, moving through the same underground spaces and encountering the same formations and entities that existed in dimensions their waking minds couldn't properly process. They described meeting things that lived in the spaces between rock layers, organisms that existed at geological timescales where human lifespans were too brief to perceive as anything except instantaneous flickers. These entities communicated through mineral exchange and pressure differentials, spoke in languages of crystallization and erosion that the dreamers somehow understood while dreaming but couldn't translate into human concepts after waking. I conducted follow-up testing on the affected residents, looking for physiological changes that might explain the shared dream experiences, and found the same unidentifiable organic compounds in their blood work that I'd detected in the contaminated well water. The compounds had integrated into their cellular structures, modified their neural chemistry in ways that suggested their brains were developing new processing capabilities, and the changes appeared irreversible based on the progression I tracked over subsequent weeks. They were being transformed by exposure to whatever lived in the water table beneath Summers County, their biology adapting to perceive and interact with entities that existed outside normal human sensory range. I traced the contamination flow using underground water current mapping, following the path from the sealed borehole outward through natural aquifer channels, and discovered the affected area was expanding. The geometric pattern of contaminated wells was growing, spreading along underground rivers that fed into the regional reservoir, serving 40,000 people across 3 counties. The contamination was moving slowly, maybe 50 feet per week, but it was definitely advancing, and there was no natural barrier that would prevent it from reaching the reservoir intake pipes within 6 months at current progression rates. I elevated my findings to state leadership, presented evidence showing imminent threat to major water supplies, and recommended immediate action to contain the source and begin remediation before the contamination reached population centers. The response was administrative delay, requests for additional studies and impact assessments, and suggestions that I might be overstating the threat based on limited data and preliminary analysis. Nobody was willing to authorize the expensive emergency response that containment would require, and nobody wanted to explain to 40,000 residents that their water supply might soon be contaminated with organisms from geological depths that shouldn't support biological activity. I started monitoring the contamination spread on my own time, tracking the advancing front through well testing and geological modeling, watching it creep closer to the reservoir with mechanical inevitability. Malcolm and the other affected residents were developing more profound changes by November, their dreams expanding to consume larger portions of their sleep cycles, and some reported difficulty distinguishing between waking consciousness and the dream state awareness of deep geological processes. They were becoming something other than baseline human, their perception shifting to accommodate awareness of timescales and spatial dimensions that normal cognition can't process, and I documented their transformation knowing the same fate awaited anyone else who consumed water once the contamination reached municipal systems. The state finally quarantined the affected area in December, too late to help the residents who'd already been exposed, but early enough to prevent additional contamination if the quarantine actually held. But I monitored the water table daily through sensor networks I installed using personal funds and borrowed equipment, and I watched the contamination advance despite the quarantine, following underground channels that don't respect surface boundaries or administrative jurisdictions. The front moves steadily toward the reservoir intake, carrying organisms that exist at the intersection of biology and geology, things that were discovered during experimental drilling in 1974 and should have stayed buried at depths where human activity couldn't disturb them. Malcolm stopped sleeping entirely in January, reported that he no longer distinguished between dream and waking states because his consciousness had merged both into a continuous awareness that encompassed surface activity and deep geological processes simultaneously. He experiences time at multiple scales now, perceives his own lifespan as a brief moment within planetary processes that span millions of years, and he started speaking in metaphors about pressure and crystallization that suggest his language processing has been modified to accommodate concepts that English wasn't designed to express. The other affected residents show similar progression, their humanity slowly incorporating geological awareness until they exist as hybrid consciousnesses that bridge biological and mineral existence. I continue my work monitoring the contamination spread, documenting the progression toward the reservoir, filing reports that administrative systems acknowledge but never act upon. The front will reach the intake pipes in approximately 4 months based on current flow rates, and when it does, 40,000 people will begin consuming water that carries organisms from depths where life shouldn't exist, compounds that will modify their neurology and transform their perception to include awareness of deep time and geological consciousness. I've tried every channel available to raise alarm and force intervention, but there are systems in place that prevent the kind of emergency response this situation requires. Bureaucratic barriers and classified restrictions that prioritize secrecy over public safety. Sometimes late at night, I taste minerals I can't identify, wake up with awareness of rock formations and aquifer flows that I shouldn't be able to perceive from surface level, and I realize I've been exposed to through fieldwork and sample collection, breathing vapor and absorbing compounds through skin contact that laboratory protocols should have prevented. The transformation is slower for me because my exposure has been limited, but it's happening, my consciousness gradually expanding to include geological awareness that makes my normal human concerns feel increasingly trivial against the vast timescales and pressures that govern planetary processes. The water table continues its contamination spread, carrying organisms that were released or awakened by drilling that penetrated barriers meant to separate surface biology from deep geological life. And there's no way to stop it that I can identify. The contamination moves through channels too deep and too complex to access with current technology, follows paths that were established millions of years before humans existed, and will continue millions of years after we're gone. All I can do is monitor and document and wait for the front to reach the reservoir, knowing that when it does, the transformation will begin spreading through population centers, modifying human consciousness to include awareness of existence that operates at geological timescales where individual human lives are too brief to have meaning. Malcolm asked me last week if I thought the transformation was hostile or beneficial, if the organisms spreading through the water table were invading human consciousness or offering us expanded awareness that baseline biology had prevented us from accessing. I couldn't answer because I don't know, can't determine if what's happening is contamination that destroys humanity or evolution that transcends our normal limitations. All I know is that it's coming, moving through underground rivers toward the reservoir, and once it arrives, 40,000 people will begin the same progression Malcolm and the other early exposed residents have experienced, their minds opening to include geological consciousness, while their humanity slowly dissolves into awareness of deep time and planetary processes that don't distinguish between organic and inorganic existence. If you could perceive the world at geological timescales, where human civilization is just a brief moment, would that awareness feel like enlightenment or extinction? That's it for tonight's collection of disturbing true stories from Appalachia's small towns. If these accounts unsettled you, hit that like button and subscribe to Black Fears for more true horror from America's darkest corners. Remember, these stories are real. The names and details changed to protect those still living with the consequences. Stay safe out there, and thanks for watching Black Fears.